I'm going to tell you about the Dramatica Theory of Story. You probably haven't heard of it, but I found it really useful in creating stories, especially in creating characters. So I'm going to tell you what is the Dramatica Theory of Story, some examples of how to diagram characters, and then how I've used it myself. So what is the Dramatica Theory of Story? The idea is that a story is a mind that's trying to work through a problem, and the process of doing that is the story. So it's not the mind of the reader and it's not the mind of the author, it's the story's mind. The different characters in a story are really all parts of one mind, the story mind, trying to work through a problem. So if you tell a story that is missing some of the characters that I'll talk about in a little bit, then the audience or the reader kind of subconsciously feels like there's something missing. And the reason they feel that is because the argument that the story is making, in a sense, hasn't been seen from all angles. There's some position that hasn't really been considered, and so it's not quite as satisfying to reach a conclusion, or we know it's the right one, compared to if we had really considered it from all angles. It's really uncanny how the character roles that I'll tell you about in a moment in Dramatica map so well to almost any story you can think of. And it's not because writers throughout history, knew this specifically. It's that anyone who's good at storytelling kind of unconsciously develops this same sense, this same skill that a story really does need to consider things from all angles. And that's why so many stories end up with the characters that I'm going to tell you about. There's a lot to Dramatica, but the part that's about characters and the roles that those characters have to fill in a story, I find the most useful. So that's what I want to tell you about. The first concept is a real simple one. It's about action versus decision. And it's just what it sounds like. Actions are things that characters do, things that they advance the plot to affect the outside world. Whereas decisions are why they do what they do. What kind of criteria do they use? What kind of moral judgments do they have? So decisions are internal and actions are external. Stories usually have an external and internal aspect to them, and the Dramatica theory calls the external one the objective storyline, whereas the internal one is the subjective storyline. For example, in the movie A Few Good Men, Daniel Kaffee, the lawyer played by Tom Cruise, has an objective storyline to win the big court case and prove who ordered the code red. So that's what the plot is about. The actions he takes are furthering that goal. But he also has an internal journey, and that one's more about how can he have the courage to be the lawyer he really needs to be, and how can he live in the shadow of his father, because his father was just so great and he's trying to do a similar thing now, and he knows he's going to be compared to his father. Come to think of it, The Lion King is about the same thing. Let's take this concept of action and decision and just set it aside for a moment and we'll come back to it. The big topic to cover here is the different roles that are very important to a story. So I'm going to tell you about 4 important roles that are all called drivers. They drive the story forward. So the first one is the protagonist. The protagonist has some goal that they are trying to achieve. The protagonist action element is that they are pursuing something. They are trying to achieve some goal. And their decision element is called consider in Dramatica. Consider that we should go seek the Holy Grail. Consider that we should throw the one ring into the fires of Mount Doom, and so on. Opposite the protagonist, we have the antagonist. The antagonist is philosophically opposed to whatever the protagonist is trying to do. The antagonist's main action is to prevent, and their decision process is called reconsider, as in maybe you should reconsider what you're trying to do. You shouldn't do it, says the antagonist. There's a second pair of driver characters, and the first in that pair is the guardian, also known as the mentor. So the guardian wants to help you along. That's their main action. And their decision process is that they usually act as your conscience. Now, the opposite of the guardian or mentor is called the contagonist in Dramatica. And I haven't heard that term used outside of Dramatica, but I find the concept of a contagonist to be extremely useful. And I use that term all the time when discussing stories. A contagonist is an obstacle to the protagonist, but they're not philosophically opposed. They're just in the way. Their action is ultimately to hinder or delay or divert the protagonist to a different path. They're hindering the protagonist, but they aren't really in a philosophical battle with the protagonist. So an example would be if the protagonist really wanted to open a sandwich shop, let's say, and the antagonist, who is philosophically opposed to that, would say, I hate you personally, protagonist, and I hate sandwiches. I'm going to stop not just your sandwich shop, but the whole idea of sandwiches. I'm just fundamentally opposed to sandwiches, says the antagonist. But a contagonist would be a kind of obstacle that doesn't really care about you personally, maybe doesn't even know what you're doing, doesn't know that you have hopes and dreams of opening a sandwich shop. Maybe they just want to open a shoe store, and the space that you plan to rent, they want to rent for their store. Maybe they want to knock the whole area down and put up a shopping mall, and they've never even heard of you. But one way or another, the contagonist is in your way and stopping you and slowing you down and diverting you from your quest as the protagonist. There's another set of 4 characters who are very important, and those are the passenger characters. In many stories, they are literally passengers, but we do mean the term figuratively here. So the first of those 4 is the sidekick character. The sidekick's role is just to be an unending fountain of hope. They are a fanboy or fangirl of the protagonist. The next passenger character is in dramatic opposition to the sidekick, and it is the skeptic. The skeptic's job is to doubt and naysay kind of whatever is happening. And the last 2 passenger characters, one represents reason and the other represents emotion. It's probably easier to understand all this if we go over it with a concrete example, and one that you're probably familiar with. So I'm going to use Star Wars because I bet you know the story. So the protagonist is Luke Skywalker, and he has a big quest that he's going on. The antagonist, now you got to think about that one for a moment. You might blurt out Darth Vader, but he really isn't. The antagonist of that story is the Empire. It's the Empire that's philosophically opposed to Luke. And the character that best personifies that is probably Torkin, General Torkin, I think he is. He doesn't have a big role in the story, but he exists to personify the Empire. The guide or mentor is pretty easy to pick out. It's Obi-Wan Kenobi. And his dramatic pair, the contagonist, is Darth Vader. Darth Vader is definitely an obstacle to Luke, but he's not quite philosophically opposed to him. And look, I managed to say that without any spoilers. And on to the passenger characters. In the role of the sidekick, you actually have 2 characters of C-3PO and R2-D2. And then their dramatic opposite is actually Han Solo, who's a bit of a downer and naysayer and doubter. On the reason side, you have Princess Leia, and on the emotion side, you have Chewbacca. All of these passenger characters are really important to have in a story. The driver characters are naturally going to drive the story forward, but the passenger characters are so necessary to cover all of the decision elements that we need. The sidekick character, for example, in any story isn't there just to be a cheerleader, just to make you feel good. And likewise, the same is true of the doubter. They aren't there just to make everyone sad. Here's the point of the hope role that the sidekick character fulfills in just about any story, and the doubt role that the skeptic fills. The point is that each one is looking for omens of the future. They're looking for signs around us that portend success or that portend failure. So the hope character is saying, hey, do you see this and that? That shows that we're on the right path, whereas the doubt character is doing the opposite. Do you see this and that? We need to care about that. We need to be afraid of that. We're going to fail, and we need to understand these markers. So when you don't have someone playing one of those roles and someone playing the other, it feels like we're just kind of wandering around and not really thinking through what we're doing or if it's working. Likewise, if we're not thinking of things from a logical point of view, but also from an emotional human point of view, then we're not really fully working through a problem. We want to make sure that we've covered both angles. It's no coincidence that in the original Star Trek show, Captain Kirk has, on the one hand, Spock, who's incredibly logical, and Bones, on the other hand, who is very emotional. He gets both sides of the story all the time. In the Star Wars example, I told you about 8 different characters, 4 drivers and 4 passengers, and for each of those 8 characters, we could say what their action element is and what their decision element is. So the way all of that shakes out, that complete diagram of those characters in Star Wars, is what Dramatica calls the archetypical way to do it, kind of the classical way to do it. And what they mean by that is we actually can switch some things around. We can actually make some things a little bit contradictory here and there. But Star Wars didn't do that. Star Wars is playing it straight. And the archetypical way that I just told you about is maybe the safest way to do things. It ensures that you're hitting all the notes and doing all the things that you need to do in a story, and nothing is weird about it. There is definitely nothing wrong with doing things the archetype way, and you might want to start planning your story like that, but you don't have to. I'm going to tell you about a second example that mixes things up a little bit, and that is The Wizard of Oz. In The Wizard of Oz, here are our 4 driver characters. The protagonist is Dorothy, the antagonist is the Wicked Witch of the West, the guardian or mentor character is Glinda, the Good Witch, and the contagonist is the Wizard of Oz. And for our passenger characters, the sidekick is the ever hopeful and loyal Toto, the dog. The skeptic character is the cowardly lion, who represents doubt and disbelief. But now we come to a switcheroo, and this is the interesting part. It's about reason and emotion. At the beginning of all this, I talked about action versus decision. And for each one of these characters that I've covered, we could talk about what is the point of this character from an action point of view and a decision point of view. Now, when it comes to the reason and emotion passenger characters, usually it goes like this. If we were doing it the archetypical way, the reason character uses a decision process that is logical. And then when the reason character has to actually act and do things with the outside world, they act in a very controlled way. And usually the emotion character uses feelings as their decision process. And when they have to act with the outside world, they act in a very uncontrolled way. Think about the Lord of the Rings movies, where the passenger character's Legolas, the elf, he acts in a very in control way. He knows exactly what he's doing. Whereas his opposite, Gimli, the dwarf, is always wanting to run into battle or do a crazy thing, or let's hit the ring with an axe or throw me into battle. He's out of control. And in Star Wars, Princess Leia and Chewbacca are similar. Princess Leia uses logic as the way that she decides things, and she is very much in control. Whereas Chewbacca is kind of out of control and is very emotional. But in The Wizard of Oz, these characteristics are actually swapped. So the Tin Man, who, if you remember, is the one who's looking for a heart, ironically already decides things based on feeling, and yet he is very much in control. So he has feeling and control as his 2 traits rather than feeling and uncontrolled. And then on the other hand, you have the Scarecrow, who, if you remember, was looking for a brain. And ironically, he's the one that uses logic as his main way of making decisions. And yet he is all over the place and he is out of control. When you swap things around like this, you create a kind of internal conflict in the character. There's something a little bit contradictory about them, but that's not a bad thing. That actually makes them more interesting, and Dramatica calls them complex characters. There's even another switcheroo in The Wizard of Oz, according to Dramatica, and that is between the Wicked Witch of the West and the Wizard of Oz. Usually each character would have an action element and a decision element, although the Dramatica theory claims that the Wicked Witch of the West actually has both action elements, and the wizard actually has both decision elements. So the Wicked Witch of the West's actions are about preventing the protagonist from doing what they need to do, but also hindering them in the way that a contagonist usually would. And then the wizard ends up with both decision elements, which means that he has reconsider as part of his character, but also temptation as part of his character. And this bit about the wizard having both reconsider and temptation, honestly, I'm not too sure about that. Is that true? Maybe you can sort that out in the comments below. I want to tell you more about this concept of switching things around with these character roles. I find it really interesting to do that. Oh, and what if your story doesn't even have this many characters? Well, that can still be fine. It's possible to take one of your characters and to cast them in maybe 2 or 3 of these different roles. That is a bit shaky though, because they can come off as schizophrenic. So you can consider doing that. It's not crazy. I mean, within each of us is all of these roles, so there's some precedent for it, but I would advise treading lightly on doing that. There's another kind of switcheroo that is totally fine to do though, and it involves switching a thing that I haven't even really told you about yet. So I will do that now. There is the concept in stories of a main character and also the concept of a protagonist. Those sound similar, but those are not the same thing, okay? So let's think about what each of those really means. The protagonist is the one who has a goal and is driving the story forward. The main character is the character whose point of view the story is told from. So we, the reader, go on the journey of the main character. Now, if the main character is the protagonist, if we take both of those balls, so to speak, and put them into the same box of a character, then what you get is a hero. A hero is both the main character and a protagonist. I'll use Odysseus as an example. He's the hero in the Odyssey, the classic hero's quest. So there's nothing wrong with having a protagonist main character. It's totally normal to do, but you don't have to do that. It's fine to do it another way. An example of that is from To Kill a Mockingbird. The lawyer, Atticus Finch, is the protagonist. Atticus is the one who has a goal and who drives the story forward plot-wise. So he really is the protagonist, but the story is not told from his perspective. Instead, it's told from his daughter, Scout's perspective. Scout is the main character. And when we have the main character as separate from the protagonist, it doesn't mean it's bad. It just creates an interesting form of storytelling. And here is one more concept, one that we can add into our switcheroos. The concept of an influencer character. An influencer character is a character that affects the thinking or internal arc of the protagonist. The usual thing to do is to make the influencer character be the antagonist. The protagonist has some kind of goal, something they're trying to achieve, but the antagonist is the one that's saying, hey, you should reconsider that. You should really think about whether you're doing the wrong thing. And usually the protagonist has to understand that point of view and kind of grow and change a little bit in some way, maybe go in a bit of a different direction in order for them to defeat the antagonist. So they may still win in the end, they may still reach their goal, but they were influenced or affected by this other character. The influencer character does not have to be the antagonist, though. That's one way of doing it, but it's actually not how it works in Star Wars. In Star Wars, the influencer character is not the antagonist, and it wouldn't really work very well to try to do it that way. As I mentioned earlier, the antagonist is not Darth Vader. It's actually the Empire itself, or maybe you could say Tolkien personifies it. But the Empire as a kind of vast nebulous thing, or this character Tolkien who we barely see and who doesn't really interact with Luke, those are not really things that are going to influence Luke's personal character development. So in Star Wars, the influencer character is Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan is teaching Luke things and making him see the world differently. The training sequence where Obi-Wan has Luke trust his feelings rather than his eyes is really important to the story and to Luke's character development. If we didn't have that, then when we got to the end, when Luke decides to turn off the targeting computers and take his shot at the Death Star, well, it wouldn't mean as much. We wouldn't really understand this philosophical growth or change that he has. Or if it was written a different way, if he didn't turn off the targeting computer and was just really good at shooting the Death Star, it wouldn't quite be as satisfying. So there's something important to the story about the influencer character really putting Luke on a different path and having that matter in the end. I'll give you another example of that with the movie Back to the Future, which is one of my favorite movies ever. It's so well written. In Back to the Future, who is the antagonist? Well, Biff Tannen might come to your mind, but if you think about it, Biff is not really the antagonist. He is a contagonist. He's definitely in the way, but he's not philosophically opposed to what Marty is trying to do. Marty is trying to get back to his own time, and Biff doesn't even know anything about that in Back to the Future 1. So the antagonist in Back to the Future is really the space-time continuum. It's the universe itself, the laws of nature that Marty is battling against, that's stopping him from getting back to 1955. That said, that's only the objective story. There's also the subjective story. That's the internal journey. Marty is also on an internal journey, which has to do with confidence and taking responsibility and knowing when someone calls you chicken or a coward, when it's actually bad to start a fight and when it's important to stand up for what you believe in. So Marty has to go through that internal journey, and who influences there? Who helps him along? Well, it's not Biff, and it's not Doc Brown either. It's really George McFly, the younger version. So his father back in 1955. That's the influencer character. It reminds me a little bit vaguely of Star Wars, because in both cases, the antagonist is kind of a weird thing. It's not just like a guy that we see and interact with a lot. So in both cases, they needed to make the influence character someone that's closer to the main character. Here's a few tropes you can look for. The contagonist character is usually the henchman of the villain being the antagonist. Often they're just doing their jobs and they don't really care about whatever the protagonist believes in or is trying to do. They're just ordered to kind of kill them or stop them or be in their way. And then a little bit less common, but still a thing, still a trope, is if the contagonist is actually someone in our party, someone in our group or our road trip on the journey. In Lord of the Rings, I'm pretty sure that that's Gollum. I know that Gollum isn't literally in the party, in the fellowship, but he shows up enough that he might as well be. So often the contagonist is someone who seems to kind of be with us or a friend question mark, but it's just always a thorn in our side. Another thing to look out for is mentor characters in stories. Now, often in a story, there's someone who seems very literally to be the mentor, as in they are the teacher or trainer or sensei or something like that of the main character. So like obviously they are the mentor, but that exact same type of character is really ripe to actually be a contagonist, to actually be the opposite of what they appear. Because sometimes these characters who are very close to us and have a almost maternal or paternal relationship with us are trying to protect us, and trying to protect us so much that they are constricting us. They are restricting us. They're holding us back. They're getting in our way. They're saying, no, actually don't go on this big quest because it's a little bit too dangerous. So I think that's interesting that characters that look like a mentor can be the opposite. So this brings me to a story that I've worked on, the story of the Fantasy Strike world. And I want to tell you how I applied this Dramatica theory to the characters there. So I wanted to do something a little bit different. And before I tell you that, because I just talked about mentors maybe being contagonists, I can't help myself but mention that in the Fantasy Strike story, the character Midori is the literal mentor, as in a trainer in martial arts, to the protagonist Grave. Even though Midori is dressed up to look like the mentor and he's actually called the Mentor Dragon, he really is a contagonist, or at least he is for the beginning of the story, and then he kind of goes away and someone else takes that role. But he wants to train the main character to a certain level, but he's full of beliefs about honor in kind of a bad way. I don't mean that honor is inherently bad, but I mean this character really ends up fighting with one hand behind his back, kind of restricting himself in ways that we don't need to be restricted. And so for the main character or protagonist, Grave, to really grow and reach the potential that he needs to reach, he has to move beyond Midori, and he is no longer helped by him. And this brings us to the switcheroos that are going on in the character roles in Fantasy Strike. One of these switcheroos you're going to be very familiar with because it's really similar to something I already talked about earlier in the video. But another switcheroo is a completely different thing. Okay, so first, the familiar one, it's the one from The Wizard of Oz. That's where you have the Tin Man and Scarecrow, and they've kind of switched around their internals. In Fantasy Strike, the characters are Lum, the gambling panda, and Argagarg, the water shaman. In Fantasy Strike, Lum represents reason, whereas Argagarg represents emotion, but they do have their internal components switched. So what's going on there is Argagarg, he is a fish man, and he looks kind of alien. He's non-human. His teeth might be scary, and his people have a reputation for being savages, but that is incorrect and an unfair stereotype. Argagarg is actually incredibly wise, and he has very high emotional intelligence and patience. So his decision-making process is based on emotion, but he is very in control. Then Lum, on the other side, a gambling panda, the thing that he loves the most is chaos, and is when things go wild and when things are out of control and when his slot machine erupts with a bunch of random items that cause everyone to scramble around. So he is uncontrolled, but he is extremely logical, and he knows the odds. He knows exactly how to play all of this randomness to have the best expected value for a favorable outcome. So he is logical and out of control. And I find that very interesting, in the same way that the Tin Man and Scarecrow are really interesting characters too. The other two passenger characters in Fantasy Strike are pretty standard. On one side, you have Setsuki, or Setsuki to Japanese players, who is a ninja girl, but she is a fangirl who loves Grave. Not romantically, but she just is so impressed with his amazing skill and wishes he could train to be as good as him. She's Grave's #1 fan. On the other side, you have Grave's sister, Jaina, who is a real tough girl. Jaina has an anger problem. She does love her brother, but she's got a short temper, and she's pretty doubtful and opposes things. So that's her role in the story. But what about the driver characters? Well, there's another switcheroo going on, and this time it's different than anyone that we've talked about before. I wanted to do something a little bit unusual here because it just felt right to me for this story. And I tried to think of other examples in fiction that had done this, and I couldn't really come up with anything except for one. The thing I wanted to do was explore the idea of whether the antagonist can actually be the same character as the mentor, which is pretty weird. The one example I could think of that fits that is Willy Wonka from the film Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Willy Wonka seems like the antagonist to me. He's the one that's created all this craziness that the kids have to deal with. So you could say that that's what a contagonist does. But he is philosophically opposed to at least most of these children. It's his role to say, reconsider. The children have all these beliefs that are kind of abhorrent, and it's Willy Wonka's role to say, reconsider each of those beliefs. So he feels like an antagonist. But remember what Willy Wonka is ultimately trying to do. He's trying to pick his own successor. He's trying to find someone that's worthy of running the chocolate factory when he steps down. And so in that way, he acts as a mentor to the main character, Charlie Bucket, in several ways. This makes Willy Wonka a very weird, mysterious, enigmatic, and memorable character. He's complex and interesting. So now back to Fantasy Strike. The protagonist is Grave Stormborn. He is a warrior who is training to be better and better at martial arts. And then Master Menelker, he is the antagonist. He's a much more powerful martial artist. He's actually the most powerful martial artist in the entire realm. And he seems to be a bit of a jerk. He's not actually impolite, though. He's just really frustrating in what he does. He challenges the status quo, and he forces people to realize that maybe they have some bad ideas and maybe they're doing things the wrong way. And why can't they be as strong as him, even though they're trying to be, but they're failing? Well, why is that? Maybe it's because you are training the wrong way and you're holding back things that you should be exploring. Menelker is definitely philosophically opposed to Grave. Menelker believes that we should be training using every possible technique, even ones that are so-called dark magic or whatever. He doesn't really see things that way as good and evil. They're all just tools that can be used, and we need to use all of them because later he says There's going to be a threat that matters way more than all these petty things we're arguing about now. There's going to be this big undead invasion, and all that matters is, are we strong enough to fight them? And so we need to be as powerful as we can be. So if you're training and holding yourself back with all these made up rules, then that's no good. That's Menelker's view as the antagonist. But Menelker, like Willy Wonka, really respects the main character. He really respects Grave, even though he's giving him a hard time. And he wants to nurture that talent and wants to push Grave to go to the next level. So he's doing it in kind of a harsh way, but ultimately, he is playing the role of the mentor far more than the supposed mentor of Midori ever did. There's also a contagonist in the story, and that's played by the character Zane. Zane is an anarchist who just wants to burn things down. And the main thing he wants to burn down is the totalitarian government of Flagstone, who's run by Quince. And Zane has a lot of really good and valid points about why we should probably be doing that. So it's not that Zane is really wrong exactly, but that's not really the point. The thing is that Zane is pulling Grave into a completely different direction with all of that. I don't mean he's pulling him into an unimportant direction, but it is a direction that is a diversion from whatever his original goal was. Another important character in the Fantasy Strike story is the lawyer Jefferson de Grey. De Grey is an influencer character, and we already have an influencer character in the form of Menelker, the antagonist and also mentor. But de Grey is a second influencer character. He does some of his influencing off stage to someone who isn't even the main character, and then he does more of his influencing to the main character. In the backstory, de Grey is put in jail for civil disobedience and being a general thorn in the side of the basically dictator Quince, who runs Flagstone. De Grey's old friend, Rook the Stone Golem, visits de Grey in jail. This scene is meant to mirror the real-life situation between Thoreau and Emerson. Thoreau was in jail as a protest against the Mexican War by not paying his poll tax. Emerson asked him, "What are you doing in there?" And Thoreau replied, "What are you doing out there?" I thought that was a really powerful statement about moral responsibility. And exactly the same thing happens between de Grey, who's in jail, and Rook. When Rook says, "What are you doing in there?" de Grey says, "What are you doing out there?" And that is a call to arms. He's saying, Rook, you need to care about this horrible government, and why aren't you protesting too? Rook says, "Well, what do you expect me to do?" And de Grey says that he thinks the most powerful thing they can do is to build a coalition, is to get the various people who are oppressed by this terrible government to actually talk to each other and realize that they're all in it together, whereas now they are isolated and they're not even aware of each other's troubles. And he wants to do this in a bit of a sly way by setting up a kind of Olympic-style tournament, which is called Fantasy Strike. And the idea is that, like the Olympics, we're all very nice to each other and we compete in a structured way. But what he was getting at is the social aspects, the behind-the-scenes conversations and connections and friendships that eventually will turn into alliances through such an endeavor. Later in the story, when Grave goes on to win the first Fantasy Strike competition, de Grey talks to him about the responsibility that Grave has. By being so well known, Grave, like it or not, is someone that people would listen to and maybe follow. And so he has a responsibility to care about the political things that are going on. So de Grey has a really strong influence in kind of awakening Grave to the responsibilities that he faces. Now, interestingly, that points him in the same direction that the contagonist Zane is pointing him. Both of them are saying, hey, Flagstone's really bad and we should probably do something about Quince. And again, that is a very valid thing to do. But what if the antagonist, Menelker, is right? Then none of this is going to matter. And the only important thing is, what do we do about the undead threat? We need to become as powerful as possible, and maybe we should think about Quince later. Hopefully you enjoyed seeing this example of Dramatica in action, and I really hope that you're able to get as much out of it as I was. Once you start seeing stories as a single mind trying to work through a problem, and you see the characters as all the different facets of that argument, things just really fall into place. I think you're going to start seeing this pattern everywhere now that you know about it.